Hello and welcome to Metal Effort. My name's Nehemiah. This is part 2 of our series called Beginner's Guide to the Knife Hobby. Today we're going to zoom in on exactly what does make a good knife a good knife. Let's start with a really bad example. This is the Z Hunter. This is a famous example of just a terrible knife that Nick Shabazz likes to make fun of. Today we're going to use this as our prototype bad knife. Aside from the aesthetics, it's probably not the best looking knife as far as these skulls and the bright green color. It's definitely ugly, but it's deeper than that, much deeper than that. And so we're going to kind of take a little walk around this knife and kind of point out some of the things that, maybe if you're new to the hobby or if you don't exactly, have done research into what makes a good knife, wouldn't notice. First off, I want to point out serrations. Now, I don't know what it is, but seasoned vets, you might say, in more of the militaristic or public service arenas might consider a knife like this, usable. Serrations help to cut through things that are sometimes harder to cut through, stuff like seatbelts maybe, and you kind of got like a little saw feature. Now, the issue with this is serrations are kind of a stopgap for what the knife should be doing without serrations. Something that has been properly sharpened will actually cut through things much easier than this one ever would. Something that maybe I don't need to saw through, it just cuts through. Cutting through seatbelt with this knife is going to be smooth as butter. And if you have a knife that hasn't been properly sharpened, or maybe it used to be sharp but has quickly become dull, no longer cuts, then serrations kind of fill in the gaps. So first thing I want to tell you is, unless you have a very, very obscure, specific reason for serrations, like maybe you work in search and rescue and maybe you're cutting through like car doors or something like that, there are situations where serrations can be useful. In the vast majority, 99% of the time in a pocket knife, serrations are almost always worse than just a properly sharpened knife. That does coincide a little bit with proper steel, that once you get it sharp, it will stay sharp for a longer period of time. Next, I'm going to point out the ergonomic faux pas that this knife creates. Now, this jimping here on the liner lock is there so that you can get enough grip on that liner lock to disengage the knife. Okay. The problem is that liner lock is coming up instead of having the knife give you space for access to that liner lock. So here, I can't see the liner on the inside, but I turn it over and it's been sunken in to the body. So this side is accommodating access to the liner lock instead of having to just make the liner lock awkwardly raised up and uncomfortable. The difference being, when I hold this knife, I don't feel the liner lock at all, but on this one, it's digging into my fingers, obviously. So, small little design faux pas. Next one you'll notice is that this knife doesn't engage all that reliably. What I mean by that is I could flip open the knife and maybe it locks into place, or maybe it looks like it's locked into place, but it's actually able to close onto you. That's not good. Not only is it undesirable from an aesthetic or a practical sense, it's just darn right unsafe. This knife should not be used for cutting. It's that unsafe. Second thing, in order for you to close the knife, you can't really get this across in video, but I'll just tell you, it's pretty loose right here, but once I reach this point, there's resistance. That resistance is a spring. This is what's called an assisted knife. So when I'm closing the knife and I push it shut, I've now loaded that spring so that when I go to flip it, it comes out pretty good, right? A lot of Kershaw's cheaper, more popular knives are assisted. And so since so many knives are assisted in the market, and maybe, you've bought a knife or two in your time and you made it to this video, you don't know that assisted is actually seen as a negative thing in the knife hobby. The reason you have a spring in the knife to help you open it is because the action is so bad, it needs it. It's effectively having bumpers in when you go bowling. If you're a good bowler, you don't need those bumpers. In contrasting, another budget knife, obviously this still costs more than the Z Hunter, This doesn't have a spring, but it's been properly tuned such that it opens even better than this one does with the spring. The way that you achieve that is precision, craftsmanship, and design, but also just things like a steel bearing. So inside this, instead of just washers, there's a track with little metal balls that are lubricated so that the blade can move along the inside of those liners at a much smoother clip. The detent is a little ball on the inside. You can see it right there on the inside of that gold liner. That ball, when I close the knife, it's going to push that liner lock aside, and then once it finds that hole that's been kind of machined into the side of the knife, that liner is going to pop back into place. You see now it's pushing into that little divot. What that does is twofold. One, it keeps the knife safe. So if I try to shake the blade out, it won't come out. It's not going to open up in my pocket because that detent is holding it. The second function is that having that detent hold the blade in with a certain amount of force, when I go to flip the knife, that pent-up pressure is going to eventually break that detent and flip the knife forward with all that force. When you look at the Z Hunter, there is no detent ball. So next thing is the blade. The blade, when it's closed, is set to one side. It's not centered here. It's really difficult at inexpensive prices to machine a knife correctly so that when it's all put together, the blade is actually lined up in the center of the knife. Now, there's nothing drastically wrong with it being a little off to the side, but some knives are so poorly designed or so poorly put together or so poorly maintained that eventually this knife will start to scrape up against the side of the liner. That's bad. Sometimes it's a clue that the pivot is loose and you'll have some blade play. Because if the blade is loose enough to be able to go perpendicular to the knife like this, then you're going to have some safety issues once again. It's more likely that the knife is going to be disengaged. It's more likely that the knife will twist or churn when you're trying to make a hard cut. It's very dangerous. Next thing, a lot of cheaper knives have this DLC coating on the blade. Now, this is totally up to your preference, but a lot of people think that black just looks cool. The problem with this is a couple things. One, when you do scratch the blade, it's going to reveal the silver underneath. That looks a lot worse, where if you have a scratch and, just a satin finish, you'll see it, but it's not going to be as bad as like silver on black. Second thing, usually that's to hide how inadequate the steel is. Most people don't know stainless steel is not stain proof. It just stains less. If I take your average good stainless steel, say like a VG10, I'll do a whole nother video on knife steels. But if I drop that in the ocean and come back an hour later, it's going to be corroded, even though that's considered a stainless steel. And so whenever you see, China stainless or surgical stainless or anything like that, this is just, it does actually tell you 440 stainless steel. That's a step above of not telling you what it is. That level of steel, something where they're not even, willing to tell you what the steel is, you should be pretty suspicious of it. And usually to, again, mask the inadequacies of the steel, they're just going to put that coating, the DLC, to seal that terrible steel from corrosion. If the steel is a good steel that's been properly heat treated, basically cooked correctly, you won't have the kind of corrosion problems that you would on these cheaper stainless steels that you get in budget knives. Next thing about a bad knife. For whatever reason, cheap bad knives have the clip on what we call the tip down carry, and it's on the wrong side of your pocket. Usually, most of us are right-handed. And so if I'm putting this in my pocket this way, I'm taking the knife out, it's a little bit awkward to do it that way. If it's in your back pocket, it's not too bad, but usually this is just awkward as far as taking the knife out quickly and deploying it and using it for whatever you need. Second thing is when you're holding the knife, you've got this gigantic clip in the way that's pushing up against you. You want the palm swell to fill your hand cave down here, not up here. This is where you have less room to hold the knife, where back here you have more room. So if you put the clip on the back of the knife, you're going to have a lot better ergonomics. If I stick it back here, that bulge in my hand is actually helping to make the knife more comfortable to hold, not worse. And so having tip down versus tip up is a major clue that this is going to be a crappy knife. Now, there are good knives that are tipped down, but the vast majority of the time, this is a quick, just a 2-second squint test. If it's tipped down, it's bad. Tip up, it's probably good. Sometimes telling if a knife is just not a good knife is a little bit harder. I think the Z Hunter is painfully obvious. A lot of major faux pas on this knife, but sometimes it's a little bit more subtle. And so for that, the deviation is a perfect example. This was the first knife I bought a couple years ago when I was getting into the knife hobby. I thought it looked cool. I know most people think this knife looks ugly, but whatever. I was definitely booty blinded on this one. After receiving the knife, I slowly became to be frustrated with a lot of things, and diving deeper and deeper into the knife hobby, looking back at this knife, it's comically terrible. And I'll show you why. First off, when you look at it, hey, it passes the clip test. It's deep carry, which I always prefer. That's less of a major faux pas, because there are a lot of good knives that aren't necessarily deep carry like this, where it really sinks into your pocket. But if it's tip up, right hand carry, and it's deep pocket, deep carry, that's a good sign usually. So the clip is surprisingly good on this. It's a little bit tight and it's hard to get in, but still does the job. The issue is everything else. You'll notice this is very blocky design, but not just in the aesthetics, but in the physicalness of it. All these sharp 90-degree angles have not been chamfered. I talked about this in my last anatomy video, but just the scraping, the amount of skin it's taken off of just holding or handling this knife, feels like every bit of it is just wanting to take a chunk of my finger with it. That's kind of annoying. Second thing, this sucker is really heavy. I think a lot of people, when they're getting into the knife hobby, think that a heavy knife means a quality knife, when usually it's the exact opposite. So let's give this a quick weigh-in. This is almost 6 ounces. This is the PM2, one of the most popular EDC knives on the planet. That's what most people would consider expensive. It's around $140, depending on the steel type you get. It might go up from there. But the size of these, this looks a lot bigger, looks like it's going to weigh a lot more. Let's give it a weigh. It's almost a full 3 ounces less. 2.5 ounces, let's say, less, and is just as sturdy, if not more so. And so the reason that this is so egregious in the weight department is kind of revealed on the inside. On the inside, this is a solid slab of steel on either side. That's heavy. Steel is heavier than titanium. The PM2 doesn't even employ titanium. There is steel liners underneath this G10, but still, it's hollowed out, meaning that they took the time to not just do a solid slab, but actually have like little holes or pockets that are machined in. This is the Civivi Backlash, and you can see this has steel liners as well, but they've got a bunch of pockets on the inside that helps with the weight. So knives that are similarly sized, but this one is like half the weight. So that was a little bit disappointing, but what's more than that is what I really care about is the action. So remember, we talked about having that spring assisted is usually a sign of poor craftsmanship and design, so that, you can't get it to deploy without a spring. This knife is basically what happens when you have bad action and you don't have a spring. It doesn't open. So a flipper should be able to flip open, and this has gotten to the point where it's basically impossible to flip open. A good, well-tuned knife is going to flip open every single time. Sometimes that is a really important difference between being able to deploy your knife quickly and not. Maybe it's just a convenience factor, maybe it's something more important. But regardless, it's not a fun thing to use this knife. It's barely adequate. Next thing, the grind on this knife is really bad. It's not so much poorly done on at the manufacturer as far as they built it to specs and sharpened it to specs. The issue is that it was designed to have the grind start really shallow. This is your primary bevel right here. But see, the blade is pretty tall and it starts like a third down, 2/3 down, I should say, a third from the bottom. And the problem with that is that the thickness behind the edge, which is you take the primary bevel and where it curves down, that little V edge is the secondary bevel. That distance between that line and this line is measured. And the thickness on this knife is much, much thicker than a reasonable pocket knife. A kitchen knife, for reference, would be about 10,000th of an inch thick. This is like 35, so about 3 times thicker than a kitchen knife. That's not good. What that means is it's not a very good cutter. Even if I get it sharp, it has to quickly pass over this very thick blade in a very short amount of time so that it feels like you're really having to work it through a piece of paper even, because it's not cutting, it's more like wedging. And I didn't understand this when I first got into the knife hobby. Having a knife be able to cut is really important. So again, we contrast this with the Backlash, which is the same price, by the way. These are both about $40. The thickness of the blade stock in the first place, the Backlash is much, much thinner. That helps. That means that you're starting with an already thin knife, and so when you grind it down, the thickness behind the edge should be less. Second thing, the grind on the primary bevel starts much higher than it does on the deviation. It's like double the height, maybe even more than that. And then another thing on top of this that makes this such a better cutter is it has what's called a hollow grind. So it's basically accelerating the thinness behind the edge by scooping out some of the material to get it really, 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 really thin behind the edge. So when you do that on top of an already thin blade stock, you get a very, very good cutter. Sometimes knife makers will do a hollow grind to compensate for a really thick blade stock. And that does help it cut into the initial cut. But if you have thick blade stock, it's going to quickly, once it hits the top of the grind, it's going to feel like that really hard to push through the material problem that we have with the deviation. This is really helped out on both the height of the grind, the thickness of the blade stock, and the hollow grind. That doesn't mean that straight or flat grinds are bad. I really enjoy a good flat edge. They're a little bit better for certain tasks, a little bit more jack of all trades types of grinds, because you could cut through something and it's a pretty steady, pressure as you go through the cut. It's not like, ooh, quick and then hard. It's pretty even all the way through. So with all that you just learned, looking at this knife, this has a false edge or swedge on the top, which is pretty much useless. It's just decoration. So if we just ignore that part of the knife, I've got a very shallow grind that's a flat grind, not a hollow grind. And so it's just a terrible cutter. Overall, this knife is garbage. It is very uncomfortable. Most people don't like how it looks. It's very heavy, so it's not a good carry, even though it has a decent clip. A lot of sharp edges, so it's uncomfortable. And it's just not a good cutter. So why do I have this? and that's really what this video is about, is you're trying to save money, right? Instead of just buying that maybe $140 knife that you hear everybody talking about, you instead get a $40 one that you think is going to be just as good, or 90% of it, when in fact this is like 10% of this knife, to the point to where I don't want to use it. I'd rather reach for a butter knife. So this is why people invest in nicer knives. Now there's a whole nother wide world of getting something blinged out, something that looks special or performs in a special way, and that's not necessarily something that I'm advocating everybody get into, but at least stepping your toes into the world of a competent, excellent knife like the PM2 or many others. Check out my channel if you want to find a good one. There's so many. This is kind of, far off in the distance. And even if you're not interested in $600 flashy, blingy knives, And even if, the $140 is out of your budget, there's still some good knives that I can recommend for around the same price of what a lot of the knives at Walmart are going for. This is a $42 knife, and it is unbelievable. It does all the things that these super expensive knives do for a fraction of the cost. So a good knife isn't just an expensive knife. A good knife is the things that I've shown you today. Does it have good action? Yes. Is it correctly designed and put together? Perfectly centered. Lightweight. Fits in the pocket. Is comfortable in the hand. And most importantly, it cuts well. So if all you take away, even if you're not going to increase your budget, there are good knives like the Backlash, the Civivi Backlash, that could meet your needs. Once you dip your toe into that pool, know that you're going to want to dive all the way in. I hope this was helpful to you. Consider subscribing. I have a bunch of ideas for new videos for this playlist to kind of help people new to the hobby. If you have questions or if there's something that you want me to focus on for a topic on a video, make sure you comment below and I'll consider it. That's it. See you in my next one. Bye.